Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us for the ARC of Fort Bend County Parent Education and Support Group meeting on Zoom today. I'm Carrie Axtell, Program Director of Youth and Advocacy Programs here at the ARC of Fort Bend County. A little bit about us. We're a nonprofit organization established in 1968 for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, also known as IDD. Disabilities such as autism, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, and many more. But our mission is to ensure opportunities for people with IDD and their families to maximize their quality of life within our community. We do that through advocacy for and with people with IDD, through community outreach and providing information about community services and resources that are available. We also provide presentations, resource fairs, and a parent support group such as this one. We hold a variety of excellent social and recreational programs such as Teen Social, Parent Night Out, a 20-something social group, adult social recreation club, Special Olympics for adults, and much, much more. So if you'd like to learn more about the ARC of Fort Bend County and what we do, I encourage you to visit our website at arcoffortbend.org, like our Facebook page, which we update regularly with community events and information. And you can also reach out to me. I have put the information in the chat box there. But if this is your first time joining us, welcome. You're in for a real treat because we are fortunate to have some exceptional professionals here in the community who share their knowledge and their expertise with us. And this month, we're very honored to welcome Dr. Maria Quintero-Conk with Tri-County Behavioral Healthcare. And she prefers to just be affectionately known as Dr. Maria. So, but before I formally introduce Dr. Maria, let's go over what to expect during today's meeting. When you logged on, the microphones were probably on mute, and that's just to help us cut down on background noise and allow us to hear our presenter better. But if you would like to ask a question, please put those questions in the chat box as you think of them. I will be compiling those, and then we'll ask Dr. Maria at the end of the presentation. We learn a lot from your questions, so thank you for asking them and contributing in that way. We all learn through this this presentation and through each other, through our questions. This again is the ARC of Fort Bend County Parent Education Support Group. We meet on a Thursday each month throughout the school year at 11 a.m. As many of you may know, this group has a dual purpose. We have a presentation first at 11 a.m. and then at noon, I will stop the recording and the parent support group meeting will begin. So I invite you to stick around after the presentation and bounce question ideas off of one another, share and fellowship as we parents often have a wealth of information and experience that we can share with one another. And as always, if you have questions you'd like to discuss privately or with me, my contact information again is in that chat box. So without further ado, we're pleased to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Maria Quintero-Conk. She earned her PhD in psychology from Utah State University, which she has shared is a very beautiful but cold state. We learned a whole new appreciation for the cold here in Texas a week or two ago. Her specialties have always been in intellectual disability and autism. For 20 years, she's worked in Houston at the Harris Center, where she developed several programs for people with IDD and autism. But she now works as the IDD Authority Services Psychologist at Tri-County Behavioral Healthcare up in Conroe. And she does the eligibility assessments for people seeking services. She loves to teach and has held an adjunct faculty positions at Lamar University, Lone Star Community College, and the University of Houston, and University of Phoenix Online. So she continues to teach. She's currently on the faculty of the Lone Star Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disorders, or LEND, and she's a fellow of the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. So Dr. Maria is here today to share her knowledge and expertise about sexuality, sexual health, and safety in the lives of people with IDD and Autism Spectrum Disorder. And she's going to discuss some of the myths, realities, and resources to help navigate this sometimes sensitive topic. Thank you for being here, Dr. Maria.
I am delighted. Thank you for inviting me. I do hope to share some information, but I also know that every family is different. So there may be some things that apply to one that don't apply to another. And hopefully everybody will get a little bit of something that they can use from our conversation. This area is a sensitive area. And I understand because in society it is a little awkward even to talk about sex in this type of setting where there are other people and we're recording and yet it's one of our basic human needs. We have human needs. We've got need for security so that we feel safe, need for food. We have a need to feel that we belong to some group, that there is a social connection that we have. We need affection and we need self-esteem. Those are human needs. Having a disability does not negate any of those basic functions. We also have basic rights. We have a right to our own bodies. As adults, we don't even think about that, but it really is the case. I own my body and I make decisions. They may be smart decisions or they may involve chocolate chip cookies and not be smart decisions, but they are mine to make. I also have a right to privacy and to intimacy. I have a right to get information about sexuality. I have a right to have relationships with other people, and I have a right to be appropriately sexual with others. If I behave inappropriately, I may be infringing on someone else's rights. And I have a right to explore my own body and to see what feels good sexually. I have those rights. People who have a developmental disability, they have those rights as well. But I recognize that it's really easy to talk about those types of generalities. Where do we start? If it were that easy, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Well, my starting point is actually kind of a curious one. It's not with that person that has that condition. It's with ourselves. To consider this area and to deal with it effectively, we first have to evaluate our own attitudes about sexuality and specifically about sex between people who have disabilities. There are some false beliefs about sexuality with people who have disabilities. For example, one belief is that they are asexual. In other words, they don't have sexual needs, they don't have sexual interests. That simply is not there. Often that assumption is tied to the fact that, well, gosh, they're just not smart enough to have those sexual interests. I think we know that an intelligence level does not have anything to do with what our bodies are responding to. So that is a myth. Another one, which I still hear and I hear frequently, is that adults with intellectual disability are like children. And often you hear, well, they think like a 5-year-old. And so the assumption is that even sexually, they're like a 5-year-old. Well, as we're going to talk about in just a little bit, 5-year-olds have some sexuality, but more importantly, a grown man or a grown woman is not a child. Uh, they may be problem solving in some areas at a less mature level, but physically, hormonally, they're sexual adults. A third myth is that they're not seen as sexually attractive by other people. Well, I think we can all agree that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And what I may find attractive, somebody else might not, and vice versa. So, yeah, actually, they may very well be seen as attractive by other people. There's the idea that they're so innocent, we shouldn't do anything to awaken their sexual needs. Actually, this one I still hear and I find a little bit funny because the thought behind it is, shh, don't talk about sex, the lion will arise. Uh, Come on. Because we talk about it doesn't suddenly unleash this beast inside an individual that has to grab everyone down the street. That's not the case, and we're not injuring an innocence. They're adults and they need information. Conversely, there are those folks that think that folks with disabilities only think of intercourse when they talk about sex, and that that's the most important sexual behavior. We're going to talk a lot about that. and how intercourse is but one relatively small part of relationships. The other one is that they only have sexual relations so that they have children. That's a myth. There's a much broader component, much broader components about sexuality. That they don't have sexual interests kind of go with that asexual, or that they all want the same thing. I think we can pretty well say that that's a myth that we can put to bed. And interestingly, one of the areas is not wanting the same thing brings us to sexual diversity. The LGBTQ community isn't just for people who have IQs over 70. Folks with intellectual disability also have interests that may go into the homosexual range or other areas. Unfortunately, there's really very little research and very little understanding about this type of sexuality. Um, there is one bit of research that's disturbing, and that is that in couples that are gay couples, people with developmental disabilities, there's a higher incidence of partner violence. Again, not enough research to really understand the root cause of that, but something to be aware of if there is a pairing and this couple may need more supports to try to understand their relationship. It may be an issue of not having enough models, not having enough supports, or perhaps having to deal with multiple stigma in our society. But whatever the reason, just kind of keep that awareness that there is some evidence of higher partner violence in gay couples. Generally, what we see is lack of support and that double stigma, which complicates their relationships. I wish I had more to give you on this. As I said, it's an area that's just getting broached within an area that needs a lot more attention anyway. Um, but I feel it's important to recognize that there is sexual diversity within the community of people with intellectual disability. And it's important also to recognize that what we're going to be talking about will be quite varied. Um, Everybody's different. And when society talks about intellectual disability, there's a tendency to just put everybody in a pocket. IQ under blank, whatever number it is. In Texas, officially it's IQ under 70. But within that range, there's a pretty broad range of abilities. And so the same program and the same approach is not going to necessarily address the needs of everybody in that group of folks with intellectual disabilities. For example, people that are more into the mild range of delays, that's about 85% of folks with ID. Their sexuality is much more typical to what we would recognize as what our lives may be like. They can create families. Usually they need supports, though. Having a family is, for example, not inexpensive and it's not cheap. So how do we do finances? And if I have a job, who takes care of the little one? All those things that are already extremely complicated for folks without a disability, people with intellectual disability may need some supports. And often the supports come from their own families, where the in-laws get together and create a system of supports for their son, daughter, or sons or daughters, so that they can move forward and have a more typical life. They need education in sexuality and the responsibilities of adulthood. Frankly, that's no different than what all of us need. I know that I was incredibly smart when I was 18 years old. I knew it all. And I have become progressively more ignorant over the years, always looking for more education. This area of sexuality, relationships, marriage, and kids, boy, I would have loved to have had a manual to guide me, and there really wasn't much. Even the internet wasn't that big back then. Uh, so obviously there are needs for supports and for education, but what you see in folks with mild intellectual disability are experiences not unlike what folks without those delays would have. Now, as we start moving into areas of moderate intellectual disability, it starts getting a little more complicated because these folks tend to have fewer opportunities to have relationships with others. Um, Honestly, there is more emphasis in private masturbation when you have fewer peers. And when many of your activities are supervised, coordinated by others, done in groups, there's less pairing that can naturally take place. And so what you see is people are still, remember, still adults, still have physical needs. The body is still looking for stimulation. There may be more emphasis in private masturbation, which again takes us back to how comfortable are we with sexuality, and if a person begins to stimulate themselves, to guide them to a place where they can do so privately and appropriately. They also need to learn to control those needs and those emotions. It is not acceptable to masturbate in the middle of Walmart. That's inappropriate. And so a person needs to learn bedroom or bathroom, whatever is designated, is okay. Walmart, not okay. And to be very clear about those boundaries. This population tends to be more vulnerable and needs to learn how to react in order to reduce the incidence of abuse or the risk of abuse. I'll go into more of that in a little while as well, because that is rightfully an area that parents are very concerned about, and we need to discuss it openly. Even with that, it's important to give the person the benefit of the doubt and allow them to express what they need to express, to recognize that their bodies are still reacting and they may be attracted to somebody. And again, acknowledging that and celebrating it in a safe way. Once we start getting into folks in that severe and profound range, now, of course, these are individuals that generally are very dependent on others and still need physical contact, still need hugs. Often they will engage in self stimulatory sexual behavior, but they need to be protected. And these are the individuals that generally are at pretty significant risk if if we're not mindful of who is taking care of them and what kinds of activities are happening with them, kind of who's minding the shop. Really, there is this a problem with increased vulnerability and for the possibility of mistreatment in people with ID. Uh, why is that? Well, first, they have more contact with people who have direct access to their bodies. If a person is not yet continent, they don't use the bathroom by themselves, then somebody's going to go with them. And that naturally puts them at some risk. Another thing is that since they were little, they've learned to depend on and trust a whole variety of caregivers. Think about that. The number of staff that rotate through, say, a group home, or the paras that change from year to year in the schools, different caregivers, different therapists. There are doctors, even. There are more adults that impact the life of a child with a developmental disability, and we teach them to comply and obey, often without question. Now, we certainly don't want to create rebels right and left and have all kinds of, quote, behavior problems in school and other places. But we need to recognize that in promoting that agreeableness and collaboration and cooperativeness, there is an element of risk there. We don't teach the difference between abuse behavior and behaviors that are positive, between what is called in other circles a good touch, bad touch. We don't teach that explicitly with folks who have developmental disabilities, and that is something that we must do, um, just as we do with other kids. Predators know that this group is low-hanging fruit. And And we have to say that some of the places that are the highest risk are the places where we trust folks the most. Schools, churches are two big ones. Um, I don't want families to walk away from this presentation paranoid and keeping their loved one in the back room, never to be seen again. What I want is to create awareness that just because we're in a trusted place doesn't mean that that place can be trusted blindly. And so, because predators will prey, and they're going to look for the easy group, and folks who have limited communication skills or who do not respond in a way that pushes the predator away, they're easier victims. So what's the solution? Now that I've scared everyone, what is the solution? Honestly, education. But what kind of education? And why bother? Well, we educate because, again, we have the same needs, because despite society's denial that people with disabilities are sexual and have sexuality, they're going to find a way to get their biological needs met. And very importantly, when we undertake this education, it's more than just biological functions. We're not just talking about intercourse. We're talking about the broad range of relationships. We're talking about affection. We're talking about friendships. We're talking about non-sexual intimate relationships. I mean, hopefully we're all fortunate enough to have at least that one friend that you can just tell them anything. And yet it's not a sexual relationship, but it is as close as you can get. Personal hygiene. The body changes a lot. Now, what do I do as my body changes? And then safe sex for individuals that are seeking to have intercourse. Education does not awaken the beast. On the contrary, it's a preventative measure against abuse. And education actually starts early. Consider sexuality at different ages. All right, now folks are going to be looking at the slide saying 2 years old. She's going to have me talking with my 2-year-old about sex. No. But I also mentioned earlier that sexuality starts very early. Yeah, sexuality starts when kiddos are pretty little with basics such as the differences between boys and girls, with parts of the body and learning names for parts of the body. Understanding that folks with an intellectual disability may take longer to learn, but once they learn something, it might stick and be there for life. Think about parts of the body. Do we want an adult man at age 35 or 40 to be referring to his penis as his wee wee? So if we teach that when they're little, because that's the cute thing we do with the little child, what are we teaching long term? This is perhaps a lesson that parents who don't have kids with disabilities don't have to consider. But parents of kids with disabilities are in it for the long haul. So consider when you're teaching parts of the body, what kind of names are you going to give that will extend further into the person's life? Public and private behaviors, what's appropriate in public and what's appropriate privately. We start learning that pretty early on. How to recognize discomfort and how to say no. Again, the good touch, bad touch. The fact that it's okay to say no to somebody that touches this part or that part of your body. And when you say no, you say it loud and push them away. Um, how many parents are considering actually teaching that? Well, the internet is full of information about how to teach the average 4-year-old to do that. How about if the 4-year-old has an intellectual disability? They need to be taught that as well. Learning how babies are born, and even learning about masturbation. No, 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 no. I am not saying take your child to the bathroom and teach them how to masturbate. Please, no, that is not at all what I'm saying. But rather the concept that touching one's self is not inherently a bad thing, but it gets done, going back to public and private, it gets done in certain places and at certain times. And no, we don't do that in the front room when grandma and grandpa are visiting. We don't do that in the front room at all, without the shaming, but certainly establishing some boundaries on what is appropriate behavior and what is not appropriate behavior. Also, at this point, let me pause and say families have different values, and I respect that. Um, I'm certainly not saying that a family needs to throw out their values and ignore them completely. Within those values, giving some consideration to the needs of a child that is not going to get this information in other ways. I don't know about you all, but I got a lot of my information about sexuality from the other kids, and about 75% of that was wrong, but it's sorted out over time. That's not going to be the same advantage and experience that the majority of kids with intellectual disability will have as they develop. So it becomes incumbent on the parent to think about what's going to be in the best interest of this person here in my home who's going to be an adult one day, uh, and, and couch that within the family values. As we get a little older, 10 to 15 years old, oh wow, here it comes, menstruation, nocturnal emissions, what commonly called wet dreams, other kinds of changes that happen with puberty, hair growing in different places, breasts developing, penis enlargement. I mean, you've got the whole, we know everything we're talking about there. Those things have to be explained. I recall a young man, um, well, early teenage boy, who became very distressed. We're talking now behavior problems, referred because he was, quote, wetting his bed. And he was upset that kept saying, I'm not a baby. I'm not a baby. He did not understand that what was happening was he was having wet dreams, the nocturnal emission, and so his bed was wet. For him, that was equivalent to urinating in bed, and babies did that, and he was not a baby. You know, that was pretty distressing for him. It was distressing for the parent as well. And it culminated in a referral for a behavior therapy plan, which of course did not do. That was a lot of angst, a lot of anxiety that with some education might have been prevented. So offer that to you as one little bit of pain that could be avoided. Understanding sexual feelings, sexual orientation is often starting to find its home around this time. And then developing and maintaining relationships, recognizing again that it may be a little more difficult for a person with a disability because the peer group tends to be narrower. Um, but a person who knows how to approach someone, how to greet them, how to engage them in conversation, even if the conversation is relatively simple, with the goal of making a friend. And then what do you do with a friend? That person is in a better position to develop and maintain relationships. And I will give you all some really good resources for ideas on how to do that in just a little bit. And guess what? Some folks with intellectual disability, um, they pair up and they get married. And before that, they need to understand the difference between sex and love. Because one can love without having sex. And there are a lot of people that are having sex without being in love. The two don't necessarily have to go together. And helping a person understand that they can love without having to have sex is important. It's important not just for their own mental health and their own growth. It's also important for them to recognize when they meet somebody that they love, the person might not be someone with good interests who tells them, if you love me, you will have sex with me. They need to understand those two are not the same. And then the responsibilities that come with a sexual relationship, like the next one on that list, you might have a baby. That's how babies are made. And when you have a sexual relationship, are you going to be monogamous? That's within the family values. Um, Also, laws around appropriate and inappropriate contact with other people. Often I hear of adults with developmental disabilities who have a preference for hanging out with and playing with um, kids, people that are younger than they are, because they have common interests. May still be into My Little Pony or something. Perfectly fine to have those interests. However, if you're an 18-year-old man hanging out with a 14-year-old boy, um, there cannot be sexual stuff there. And that's an important detail, very important detail to educate, that adults cannot have sexual contact with somebody who is younger than you are. And being very explicit and very specific about that, because the laws on sexual predators are very unforgiving. And, and I have seen some tragic cases of adults with disabilities who wind up on the sexual predator list, the website, because they bumbled into this type of relationship. So that's an important conversation to have. The goal really is to understand relationships, and it starts with the person, helping them to understand at the level that they can, who am I? Helping them to develop self-esteem, because the person who's confident about themselves is less likely to be taken advantage of. Who's in my life, and how do I behave appropriately with these different people? I promised some resources. It'll be important to go ahead and share this presentation, and I will send it to you, Carrie, so that the presentation is available, since in the presentation there are links that can guide you to a variety of materials. I love this one, the Healthy Bodies Toolkit. By the way, this is also in Spanish, and the materials that I have here also have links on their sites for the same stuff in Spanish. This one has Healthy Body for males, Healthy Body for females, and it's, again, just specifically for folks who have, this is the Parent's Guide for Puberty. This is that manual that we all wanted, the Parent's Guide for Puberty, for girls with disabilities, for boys with disabilities. And it guides through the physical changes and how to help a son or daughter to understand those physical changes, as well as the feelings that come along with those changes. Strongly recommend that. This one from Vanderbilt, Sexuality Across the Lifespan. This is another one that I think is fantastic, because it talks about the kinds of changes that we talked about a little bit earlier, from the time the person is a child on through adolescence and hitting into adulthood. What does sexuality look like? How can someone, in this case, these are educators, but guess what? Parents are educators. I have never seen a parent who was not an educator for their child. So this book is for you. It really does give some guidance on how to help to develop this knowledge appropriately at different age ranges. It's a great resource. These are free, by the way. I don't know if I said that earlier. The price is right on these. This page, it's not a booklet per se, but these are tip sheets. And each one of these on the web page is a live link. You can look at these at these links, and I just salivate when I look at it, because there's so much information here. Understanding abuse, and this is, you know, dealing with kiddos with disabilities. And look at the tip sheets that are on the right side. You can print those out. Sometimes a book can be a little bit daunting, even a booklet, but if you can get something in one page, very, very helpful to have. So this one has a ton of information. Again, if you look up at the left side, it's also available in Spanish. And for those that are auditory learners, there is this wonderful, it's a parent group. out of Utah, I believe it is, that has developed the Journey to Adulthood uh, videos. And they have a variety of skills. The particular one here that they're talking about is, obviously brushing your teeth, but they go also into the other realms, such as sexuality and adult relationships. And this one, you can sit back and listen, cup of coffee, and listen to parents who have researched this and have information to share, talking about their experiences. The last one that I want to share with you, this one does have a cost. This one is one that you can get on Amazon. It's the Social Skills Training Guide for Teaching Assertiveness, Relationship Skills, and Sexual Awareness, and they reduced it to stars. Um, I do not get any royalties or anything on this, so I just share it as a resource that you can purchase for your personal library. What I like about this particular curriculum, and I think of it as a curriculum because it has its page after page after page that can be used as a source of conversation. For example, there's a page of who are my neighbors, and what are the names? So you write the names, and how do I say hi to my neighbors? Do I kiss them? Do I hug them? Well, maybe in a particular family, yes, but maybe in another family, no. So it's worksheets effectively, but not, they're interesting and simple worksheets that guide the conversation between parent and son or daughter or grandparent and grandchildren, guide that conversation gradually from a very simple level. In fact, we talked earlier about how to open a conversation. How do you start a conversation? And it talks ways that you can develop to start a conversation. How do you start a conversation appropriately? Back to Walmart. If a fellow with an intellectual disability sees a good looking woman, to go up to her and say, I'm going to marry you, that's the stuff that works in Hallmark movies, but that doesn't work in real life. That's going to be a problem. So the materials in this book work through that, not just to say don't do it, but to say here's what you can do instead. Let's practice it. And it's progressive. It goes from that level to making friends and what's a real friend and what isn't a real friend, um, to dating, to all the way through to body parts and intercourse. Use this a lot, and I've found a lot of parents that have found it to be very helpful. Unfortunately, they do not have this in Spanish, um, but it is available in English, again, for a cost. Ultimately, we do want sons and daughters to avoid becoming victims. So in all of these resources, you'll find um, references to how to teach, how to recognize an uncomfortable situation, how to teach that, hey, if it doesn't feel right, you say no, and you say no real loud, and let's practice it. Let's make it a game. Say no as loud as you can, because you want that no to be real loud. And there's no such thing as a good secret. So somebody tells you to keep a secret, that's bad. Come on over. Uh, I have just generalized, of course, a friend might want to keep a secret. But sometimes it's a little bit better just to avoid the whole secret situation and make sure that the individual with the disability knows if somebody tells you to keep a secret, you might not want to. And this is where you go to share. There are factors that complicate the issue. One is, as we've mentioned, fewer opportunities for typical social situations. We learned how to interact with one another by bumping into each other and making mistakes and going through the awkwardness of the first date and the dance and so on. And admittedly, folks with intellectual disability have far fewer opportunities to do that. So yeah, that's complicating. It's also complicating that families can be overprotective or just plain old protective, or may buy into some of those myths that we talked about, in part because it's easier. But I think that it's because we understand, I say we, I am not the parent of a special needs child. I think in speaking with other parents of special needs kids, they understand the complexity of human relationships, the complications when there's sexual relationships involved. It's tough for a person that's coming into it with intact cognitive ability. It just becomes so much more complicated when the person has a more restricted view. Got it, but still, it's going to happen. So we need to arm ourselves with tools. There is an absence of privacy. A person living in a group home doesn't have much opportunity to just, hey, I'm going out tonight, I'm going on a date, and we're going to be in the back of the car like so many folks did in their first interactions. There is also a refusal to provide sex ed in some programs and in some situations. And curiously, there aren't examples in TV or real life. Hallmark doesn't have very many movies about couples with disabilities that can serve as inspirational examples that, hey, they're just like me. So yeah, there are real factors that complicate it. What do we do next? Well, we started with us, evaluate our attitudes about sexuality and specifically about sex between people with disabilities, and then work on developing a positive attitude towards sexuality, creating an environment at home and in other settings that invite questions and expression of the person's needs, and communicating accurate information. A person has questions, they have questions they don't even know that they have, but they demonstrate it through their behaviors, giving accurate information, and then understanding that by doing so, we're not awakening the beast. In fact, we're actually increasing that person's protection against vulnerability and victimization. There are a few other resources here, just some food for thought. Um, a little bit more about ending abuse, starting with sex ed, the fight for people with developmental disabilities' right to sex, and then some more tips down at the bottom, tips for talking about sexuality and relationships. As I said at the beginning, any one resource is not going to fit everybody, but there is something in here for everyone to just consider. If you can go away with a nugget that is helpful, that's a plus. Because really what we want is to create a future that is full of hope. We do it in areas of employment, we do it in programming. This one is such a key one. Adults with intellectual disability have the same rights to be happy as any human being does. And sexuality is a part of the human experience. Um, they need our support. But with that support, a person with intellectual disability can lead a full and satisfying sexual life. And with that, I thank you and see if there are any comments or any questions that we can take.
Yes, Dr. Maria, thank you so much for all of those excellent points and those resources. And um, looking here at the chat, and those resources are really valuable. I was going to let some people know, if you haven't been paying attention to the chat, we had another one of our contributors, Sharon, says that there's also the STARS 2 book for building relationships and sexual awareness for kids with autism. So the additional book that you found so helpful, Dr. Maria, they have a second one as well. So that's a great resource to share. I will be sending out, just so everybody knows, I will be sending out a copy of this video recording along with the presentation that Dr. Maria put together that has the links in there. So it'll take me just a little while to process all that, of course, and get that together. But when all that is ready, if you are here live on this presentation, I have, when you registered on Zoom, I have your email, so I will email that to you all. So you will get that. And then I'll also share that, like I mentioned, the recording on the ARC's Facebook page, our website and YouTube channel as well. So happy to get all this information out to as many families as possible. One question we had is, what about relationships of where one person might have an intellectual disability and the other person does not? Do you have any tips or suggestion for parents when that's the kind of situation they're looking at?
Well, I am so glad that question has come up because it is true. And thank you for reminding us. We don't want to limit the relationships that folks with disabilities have to just other people with disabilities. That's the whole point of being in a community and finding the right person. And the right person may very well be somebody who is not a person with a disability. That point that I made earlier, that folks with disabilities are not unattractive. Somebody out there is going to really value and love them. Um, I think in many ways, as a parent, there are the same considerations of, is this man or is this woman good enough for my son or daughter? So we start there. Uh, is it the right person in our opinion? Um, Obviously, the next thing is there the risk of exploitation here? What kind of motives are we seeing? That can occur in any relationship, doesn't have to be with a person with a disability, but it is a heightened consideration. And that means that the parents of the person with a disability need to feel that they are welcome within the relationship. If the partner is separating the person with disability from their family, then that is a huge red flag. That would not be a healthy relationship for anyone being separated from their family, but in particular, if that partner is putting a wedge and is creating conflict, then I would certainly suggest stepping in and becoming more directive about the relationship. Although the person with the disability might push back and say, hey, this is the one I love, so there. But the family would need to just stay integrated as much as possible. I have had the pleasure of, in this job here that I have, assessing a couple of couples where one person was the identified client for assessment and their spouse was not a person with a developmental disability, nor were their kids. Um, and so there were issues that were different marital issues. The marital issues were more around the stressor of, I have a spouse that doesn't understand some of the complexities of parenting, and I'm taking on a disproportionate amount. And in their case, in one case, they did not have family support. So it was really wearing on the one parent who could not depend on the one with the disability to be able to pick up the slack without the skills to do so. Um, those are realities, and those are conversations to have to prepare the couple. But at the end of the day, people are going to fall in love with the ones they fall in love with. So, and we encourage it, we educate, and support and stay connected. I think that is probably the biggest key, to stay connected with that couple.
Thank you for that. Are there some maybe strategies or ice-breaking conversations that maybe you would recommend parents can start off with at those different age levels? We talked about, like, maybe the pre-teenagers and then the teenagers, and then what about people where they have their loved one with an intellectual disability happens to already be in their 20s. So is there maybe some kind of as a parent or as a caretaker or loved one, where you might initiate those kind of ice breaking and start those conversations?
I think that it goes back to the comfort level of the parent that's opening up, or grandparent or other loved one that's opening up that conversation, because the individual is going to pick up on discomfort and awkwardness if we feel the discomfort and awkwardness. And if I go up to someone and go, we need to have a talk. I mean, right there, every antenna just goes, we need to have a talk. No, we don't need to have a talk. Just, hey, you know what? You really are growing and you've gotten older. You're quite a young man, or you're quite a young woman. And there's probably some relationships that you considered having. There's some people out there that might be really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about that. So, what would you do if you met somebody that you were really interested in? And just kind of having a casual approach to it. I would not start out with, okay, let's talk about how to have a relationship, but just make it more natural. And that natural approach is going to be rooted in the comfort that we develop with the reality that, yeah, this is just something we're going to talk about.
Is there a particular area of this kind of broad area between uh, hygiene to, you know, just the sexuality or the different, you know, different aspects of this topic that you find that parents struggle with more, or that there's certain resources that you think that you end up talking to people the most about, because that seems to be the most difficult part?
Boy, it's definitely anything having to do with intercourse, with sex, is really difficult. But honestly, before ever getting there, the one area that comes up regularly, and I would say almost across the board in almost every assessment, is friendship. How to define a friend. When I interview the individual, they start rattling off the names of everybody that's in their classroom, if they're still in school, everybody they've ever known. If they're on Facebook, they say they have 400 friends, which Facebook certainly promotes, but friendship is an area that really is tricky. To help an individual differentiate between acquaintance and a friendship, I think that's a pretty important point, and maybe a good starting point, because how do we then define intimacy if we don't even know what the boundary of a friendship is? That's one of the things about that STARS book that I like, is that it really drills into what's a friend, and what isn't a friend. What does a friend do? What do you do with friends versus what you do with people that you just know, acquaintances? Um, so I think that distinction is an important one, and just keeps coming up over and over again, with parents being distressed that a person who defines everybody as a friend is vulnerable. But it's also kind of sad that they're not filtering which ones they might cultivate into a deeper friendship, a deeper relationship. And in order to do that, they're going to need skills, and they're going to need some help. So friendship, I think, is a big area of common concern.
Okay. Another question we have is, are there any classes that you're aware of, perhaps online or otherwise, just about this topic in general for a person with intellectual disabilities? And are you familiar with any group settings that maybe would teach such relationship skills?
I know there is a psychologist up in the Woodlands who is in private practice. So, there is an expense for it, but has a curriculum. Her specialty is people with intellectual disability and people with autism. Just shares Dr. Michelle Garcia. And she has a curriculum that she's developed that she uses for teaching folks about sexuality. Um, she uh, she has periodically runs groups that address that. Um, and I don't know of other resources in the general area, but that does not mean that they're not out there. I know there are some YouTube videos that are pretty good on uh, explaining sexuality. I would just always advise the parents to do a search and then watch it with their particular son, daughter, or other loved one in mind, because what fits one person and one family won't necessarily fit the next one down the line. And the internet is just full of stuff out there. So yeah, I'm sure there are other resources, but I don't know. I wish I had all the resources in the whole Houston area.
Yeah, but it's good to know about, well, people such as yourself and like you said, Dr. Michelle Garcia, who there's a curriculum
Mhm.
that parents can look into. It does seem it is a very personal decision as well. And like you said, between family to family, they might want to view some of these resources online and really look at them first and make sure that those values align with what they believe in or wanting to teach.
Definitely, definitely. The ultimate message is that we can't ignore it. It has to be discussed. It will happen. The body will move forward. But there are religious considerations, there are cultural considerations, and those are very, very important and need to be part of the comfort level and the message in the family. Um, Otherwise, the awkwardness and the discomfort will come through, and the message will not be effective.
Well, if anybody else had a message or a question, you can drop it there in the chat, or if you'd like to ask it directly, you're more than welcome to do that. I think we've come to the end of all the questions that I saw there on the chat. But I want to thank you, Dr. Maria, for coming on and just giving us a lot to think about, and just realizing that really the discussion begins early, and it begins really with distinguishing that friendship and what friends are. And so it's good to keep those things in mind, because I don't think that really necessarily dawns on us that we're really introducing other concepts such as getting to sexuality just by discussing about what the body parts are, what's appropriate for different times. Um, so it gave us a lot to think about there.
Thank you so much. It's always such a treat to visit with parents. I wish that we could have done it in person, and
Yes.
I look forward to the day when we do. But it's a privilege to be able to talk with folks and just to share some ideas and some resources. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Dr. Maria.